It's 4 p.m. on a weekday in the early 90s. You're sprawled on the living room carpet, bathed in the cathode ray glow of the television set, watching a blue-skinned superhero, a magical rainforest fairy, and a group of kids on a pristine island fight off the physical embodiment of toxic sludge. On Sunday mornings, the adults in the room told us the material world was a fated ship, a temporary, sinful waiting room destined for the incinerator. It's all going to burn anyway, they said, handing out life jackets and telling us to look the other way while the earth groaned. But the weekday afternoon broadcasts were quietly telling a different story. Long before we had the vocabulary for structural sin, climate anxiety, or theological deconstruction, we were being handed a sacred mandate through the TV screen. The institutional church may have forgotten the first directive, but the cartoons made sure we didn't. We weren't just watching TV, we were being recruited. Welcome to The Faithful Citizen. I'm Ellison Keller. Let's dive in.
Yeah. Welcome to the space where conviction meets rhythm, where truth got a mic and the church gotta listen. This ain't Sunday talk, it's real life living. Faith in motion, the citizen's mission. We talk grace, we talk justice, we talk peace. Not the kind that conforms, but the kind that frees. The world's loud with noise, we cut through division. This is the faithful citizen, let's get to the wisdom.
In 1971, long before the cultural battle lines of the late 20th century climate debate were fiercely drawn, Dr. Seuss penned a warning that read less like a picture book and more like an ancient Old Testament prophecy. His book The Lorax introduced a creature who lifted himself onto a freshly cut stump and declared, "I speak for the trees have no tongues." He was the archetypal voice crying out in the wilderness, confronting the sprawling mechanical greed of the onceler. The onceler wasn't merely a villain in a striped suit. He was the patron saint of the modern industrial age, the embodiment of a ruthless theology of extraction. He looked at a vibrant, interconnected ecosystem and saw only Thneeds, commodities to be harvested, packaged, and sold at the direct expense of the air, the water, and the wildlife. Yet the profound tragedy for children raised within the American evangelical ecosystem in the 1980s and 90s was that the onceler's worldview didn't just rule the secular, hyper-capitalist marketplace, it had quietly and insidiously taken root in the pulpit. During these formative decades, the institutional church largely abandoned its original pre-fall mandate. In the opening chapters of Genesis, God the Creator's first directive to humanity wasn't to build a megachurch, manage a political voting bloc, or consolidate institutional power. It was to cultivate, care for, and steward the earth. It was a holy vocation of localized guardianship. But by the time the latchkey generation sat in the pews, that sacred mandate had been wholly consumed by an escapist, fatalistic eschatology. Obsessed with rapture timelines, left behind anxiety, and the impending apocalypse, the religious subculture adopted a troubling scorched-earth theology. The prevailing, often loudly spoken mantra was chillingly simple. It's all going to burn anyway. Why bother protecting the ozone layer, conserving the ancient forests, or fighting the poisoning of local rivers if the material world was nothing more than a temporary, sinful waiting room destined for a divine incinerator? The earth was treated like a sinking ship, and the pulpit insisted that the only holy task was to hand out life jackets, not to patch the hull. It was a spiritualized excuse to look the other way, while the oncelers of the world leveled the Truffula trees. This theology bred profound cognitive dissonance in the minds of youth. On Sunday mornings, they were subjected to a theology of ultimate environmental apathy, a complete abdication of humanity's first directive. But, as we've explored before, the generation that would eventually inhabit the decentralized church in the wilderness didn't succumb to this apathy. Why? Because the institutional church left a massive spiritual vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. When the religious gatekeepers abandoned their responsibility to teach incarnational stewardship, the mantle was quietly and subversively picked up by afternoon cartoons. Sprawled on living room carpets, bathed once again in the cathode ray glow of the television set, this cohort was discipled in the sacred duty of creation care by an entirely different set of pastors. While the church modeled a faith rooted in performative spectacle and escapist evacuation plans, the cartoons of the late 80s and early 90s stepped in to teach children that the earth was a fragile, interconnected home requiring their urgent, courageous protection. Long before this generation grew up to challenge the political syncretism and systemic injustices of the modern empire, they were baptized into a holy resistance against ecological destruction. They learned the garden's ethics from animated environmentalists, magical rainforest inhabitants, and teenage planeteers. The institutional church may have forgotten the first directive, but the television made sure we never did. If the institutional church of the late 20th century was content to let the earth burn, the television screen was desperately trying to recruit others to put out the fire. One of the earliest and most formative animated interventions came in 1988, The Smoggies, a Canadian-French co-production. For a generation of kids absorbing this broadcast, it served as a foundational, subversive catechism in ecological theology. The premise was deceptively simple, centered on the pristine, sun-drenched sanctuary of Coral Island. This paradise was home to the Suntots, a community of small, environmentally harmonious beings who lived in deep connection with their surroundings. Their peaceful existence was perpetually threatened by the arrival of the SS Stinky Poo, a coal-belching, oil-leaking ship crewed by a trio of environmentally catastrophic treasure hunters known as the Smoggies: Emma, Clarence, and Peludo. What made the Smoggies so spiritually resonant was its profound understanding of motive. The Smoggies weren't cartoonish villains who polluted simply for the joy of being evil. They were fundamentally capitalists. Emma, the domineering leader, was obsessed with harvesting the island's magic coral, believing it was the secret to eternal youth and limitless wealth. The pollution pouring from their ship wasn't the goal, it was the acceptable byproduct of their greed. They were the direct spiritual descendants of Dr. Seuss's Onceler, embodying the ultimate end of unchecked extraction. They viewed Coral Island not as a sacred habitat, but as a warehouse of raw materials waiting to be monetized. For young viewers watching on weekday afternoons, this laid the groundwork for a critical theological awakening. Long before these children were old enough to listen to bands like Rage Against the Machine scream about the military-industrial complex and the commodification of human life, they were already being taught to recognize structural sin. The Smoggies perfectly modeled the machine, a system that chews up the vulnerable and poisons the environment to fuel the engines of the rich. The cartoons subtly taught that ecological destruction is rarely an accident. It's almost always the result of a system that prioritizes profit over presence and extraction over stewardship. In stark contrast stood the Suntots. They didn't hoard resources, nor did they attempt to pave over the island to build a more efficient society. They used renewable energy, practiced sustainable agriculture, and operated through a lens of deep community care. Theologically speaking, they were living out the uncorrupted mandate of Genesis. But the most crucial lesson the Suntots imparted to their young audience was the scale of their stewardship. The Suntots weren't drafting global climate accords or attempting to save the entire planet. They were fiercely, relentlessly defending their beach, water, and coral. They taught a generation that environmentalism isn't merely an abstract, bureaucratic global policy. It's a deeply local, relational duty. It's the ultimate expression of radical neighborliness. You can't claim to love your neighbor if you're actively poisoning their drinking water or clear-cutting the forest that sustains their livelihood. The institutional church often missed this, preaching a hyper-individualized, escapist gospel that severed the believer's responsibility to the physical world. But the Suntots demonstrated that true faithfulness is rooted in the soil you stand on. Fast forward to the modern era, and the legacy of Coral Island is vividly apparent in the exile's ecclesiology. When the PBS disciple generation finally walked away from the performative spectacle of the institutional megachurch, they rejected the centralized hub-and-spoke model of religious power. They didn't build new stadiums, they scaled their faith down to the intimate size of a neighborhood. The church in the wilderness today looks remarkably like the community of the Suntots. Their new liturgy is a localized action, organizing community gardens, fighting for clean water in marginalized area codes, and resisting the systemic greed that seeks to pave over the vulnerable. They realize that participating in the kingdom of God means going out into the streets and doing the sincere, unglamorous work of Jesus. The Smoggies inoculated this generation against the sin of extraction by proving that theology without neighborliness and without a fierce, localized defense of the physical neighborhood is just dead religion. The empire will always seek to extract, but the Suntots taught us that the faithful must always remain to cultivate. If the Smoggies introduced the late 20th century latchkey kid to the localized ethics of environmental stewardship, a 1992 animated film elevated those ethics into a profound, mystical theology of the sacred. FernGully. The Last Rainforest didn't just ask its audience to protect the environment, it fundamentally redefined what the environment was. To the industrialized world, and unfortunately to much of the institutional church, a forest was merely a collection of biological matter. Board feet of lumber waiting to be harvested, or worse, temporary scenery destined for an apocalyptic fire. FernGully aggressively subverted this eschatological fatalism by presenting the rainforest as a living, breathing sanctuary, woven together by a sacred, unseen magic. The film functioned as a brilliant animated reclamation of the Imago Dei applied to the broader canvas of creation. Through the eyes of Krista, the fairy protagonist, and Magi Loon, the wise elder, children were taught that a shared divine breath intimately connected every leaf, insect, and tree. To cut down a tree wasn't simply an act of commerce. It was a desecration of the sacred canopy. For a generation raised in an evangelical ecosystem that aggressively separated the spiritual from the material, FernGully was a revelation. It taught that God's fingerprints weren't confined to the sanitized interior of a suburban megachurch, but were vibrating through the roots of the ancient redwoods. But a sacred canopy requires a profound threat to clarify its value, and FernGully provided one of the most terrifying, accurate depictions of structural evil ever committed to children's animation. Hexus. Voiced with dripping, malicious charisma by Tim Curry, Hexus wasn't a human antagonist. He was the literal, amorphous embodiment of toxic sludge, pollution, and death. He fed on industrial waste, growing larger and more powerful with every drop of oil spilled and every plume of toxic smoke released. In Hexus, the generation raised to be future radicals found another clear visual metaphor for systemic injustice. While the institutional church of the 1990s was obsessing over personal, individual sins, policing CD collections for swearing, enforcing sexual purity, and warning against the dangers of smoking, they were completely ignoring the massive structural sins decimating the globe. Hexus was the ecological manifestation of the machine. By depicting the villain as a systemic, toxic rot that weaponized human machinery, FernGully trained its young viewers to look past the individual logger and recognize the demonic nature of the extractive system itself. This brings us to the most vital theological arc of the film, Zach's awakening. Zach is the human logger who accidentally shrinks down to fairy size, forcing him to experience the rainforest from the perspective of the marginalized and the vulnerable. Before his shrinking, Zach is the quintessential blind participant in the machine. He isn't inherently malicious, he simply possesses the numbed apathy of the empire. He walks through the ancient sanctuary marking trees with a red spray paint can, a brutal visual liturgy of commodification, looking at a living ecosystem and seeing only a paycheck. Zach's transformation is a breathtaking metaphor for the spiritual concept of metanoia, the profound, structural change of one's mind and heart. His redemption doesn't come through a simple intellectual apology. It comes through an incarnational immersion. By shrinking, Zach is stripped of his imperial privilege, He's forced to live among the beings his machine is actively destroying. The climax of his spiritual awakening comes when he places his hands on the bark of a massive tree and, for the first time, feels its pain. It's a baptism of radical empathy. He realizes that the machine he helped operate isn't bringing progress, it's bringing hexus. Zach's journey mirrored the exact deconstruction the church in the wilderness would eventually undergo. This generation realized that you can't claim to follow the Creator while remaining comfortably complicit in the destruction of His creation. They saw the empire's red spray paint marking the vulnerable, whether a clear-cut forest, a marginalized community, or a militarized border, and refused to operate the machinery anymore. FernGully taught latchkey disciples that repenting of our ecological sins requires more than recycling. It requires a fundamental shift in how we view the world. It demands that we stop seeing the earth as a disposable resource waiting to burn and start defending it as the sacred, interconnected canopy it was always created to be. To save the forest, Zach had to wake up and realize he was part of it. Decades later, as the institutional religious empire eats itself, the generation raised by FernGully is fully awake, standing in the timber and refusing to let hexus have the final word. If FernGully provided the mystical theology of the sacred canopy, Captain Planet and the Planeteers provided the missiological framework. Premiering in 1990, the show was a brilliantly engineered piece of globalized pedagogy. Gaia, the spirit of the Earth, awakens to find the planet being ravaged by a rogues gallery of eco-villains, essentially a rotating cast of once-lers and hexuses, or is it hexi? Recognizing that the old centralized institutions were too corrupt or too apathetic to stop the destruction, she doesn't appeal to the United Nations, the military-industrial complex, or the corporate elite. Instead, she decentralizes the response. She distributes 5 magic rings to 5 teenagers across the globe: Kwame from Africa, Wheeler from North America, Linka from the Soviet Union and later Eastern Europe, Guy from Asia, and Matai from South America. This deliberate, unapologetic diversity was a profound theological statement to the kids watching from their living rooms. The institutional church of their youth was largely homogeneous, often deeply segregated, and increasingly obsessed with a fiercely nationalist flavor of Christianity. The pulpit frequently portrayed the other, immigrants, refugees, or anyone outside the American evangelical bubble, as an inherent threat to the fabric of society. But Gaia's global parish offered a radically different vision of the kingdom. The Planeteers demonstrated that the mandate to care for the earth supersedes national borders and political ideologies. They modeled a radical, egalitarian community in which diverse cultural backgrounds weren't erased into a synchronized melting pot, but actively synthesized into a unified force for stewardship. Perhaps the most subversive element of Captain Planet was its ending. After the eco-villain was thwarted and the environmental disaster averted, the superhero didn't stick around to establish a kingdom, consolidate his rule, or demand unquestioning worship. He looked directly into the camera, pointed at the audience, and delivered his iconic sign-off: "The power is yours." This single phrase was a pedagogical masterstroke, mirroring the quiet, decentralizing genius of LeVar Burton on Reading Rainbow. Just as Burton ended his weekly literary explorations with, "But you don't have to take my word for it," effectively handing intellectual autonomy back to the child, Captain Planet handed over the moral and physical authority to save the world. It was a profound subversion of the pastor as CEO megachurch model that dominated the religious landscape of the 90s and early 2000s. In those cavernous, heavily produced auditoriums, the implicit message embedded in the architecture was that divine power and authority were concentrated on the elevated stage, securely held by the professional religious mediator. The congregation's role was merely to sit passively, consume the spectacle, and comply. But the television screen taught the children that the power wasn't hoarded on a stage, nor was it held by politicians or corporate billionaires. The power to cultivate, heal, and defend creation was handed directly to them. It was a democratization of the Genesis mandate. When this generation grew up and watched the institutional church hemorrhage its moral authority, through political syncretism, systemic abuse, and environmental apathy, they didn't panic. They had already been trained to operate without a centralized superhero. They knew that the responsibility to build a better neighborhood didn't require the Empire's permission. Yet the true genius of the Planeteers' missiology lay in the specific synergy of their rings. Earth, fire, wind, and water represented the physical, actionable forces required to combat ecological destruction. But alone, they were insufficient. Captain Planet could be summoned only when the four physical elements were combined with the fifth, most frequently misunderstood ring, heart. Wielded by Matai, the youngest and most vulnerable member of the team, the power of heart enabled telepathic communication with animals and instilled empathy in others. In 90s playground reenactments, heart was sometimes mocked as the weakest power, yet unapologetically it was the theological linchpin of the entire narrative. The show explicitly taught that physical action, technological intervention, and even righteous anger without deep relational empathy are ultimately powerless. This represents the grand synthesis of the PBS discipleship that sustains the modern church in the wilderness. The physical elements, earth, fire, wind, water, embody intellectual rigor, systemic critique, and radicals' unyielding ferocity. They represent the necessary, militant force to tear down idols and do battle with the machine. But without heart, without the incarnational grace, the radical neighborliness, and the unconditional love taught by Mr. Rogers, that force merely becomes another weapon of the Empire. To truly care for the earth and to truly care for one another requires both the physical action to intervene and the empathetic heart to understand exactly why the intervention matters. Like the Smoggies, the Planeteers further prove that theology without neighborliness is just dead religion. By centering Matai's empathy as the catalyst for their collective power, the show cemented a truth the institutional church had long forgotten. The ultimate measure of our stewardship isn't found in our political dominance, but in our capacity to love the vulnerable. The power is ours, but it's only activated by heart. The collision between the generation discipled by weekday cartoons and the modern institutional church was inevitable. You can't plant the seeds of localized stewardship in a sacred, interconnected canopy in children's minds and expect them not to bear fruit in adulthood. As these kids matured amid the socio-political turbulence of the early 21st century, they found themselves in pews that demanded a profound and terrifying cognitive dissonance. They watched the church they were raised in aggressively merge its theology with overt partisan politics, culminating in the rise of Christian nationalism that championed environmental deregulation. The pulpit began to frame environmentalism not as a biblical mandate, but as a secular Marxist threat to the American economy. The era's prevailing eschatology, the fatalistic belief that the earth was a disposable waiting room destined for apocalyptic fire, was actively weaponized. It's all going to burn anyway, morphed from a passive, escapist theological quirk into an aggressive political platform. It became the moral justification for the machine, the very system the kids had been warned about, the system that chews up the vulnerable for profit. By aligning with corporate extraction, mocking climate science, and cheering on the dismantling of environmental protections, the institutional church had essentially formed a political action committee with the Onceler and Hexus, spray painting the red X on the rainforest and calling it God's will. This theology of the disposable earth was reinforced by the very architecture of the spaces where they worshipped. The seeker-sensitive church model rapidly replaced traditional sanctuaries with spaces modeled after corporate auditoriums and concert arenas. These windowless, heavily produced environments shut out the natural world entirely, substituting the sun and the wind for smoke machines, multisensory worship experiences, and highly calibrated lighting cues. The megachurch pedagogy relied heavily on spectacle, creating an artificial environment that severed congregants from the physical groaning of creation outside those walls. It's easy to believe the earth doesn't matter when your entire spiritual experience is manufactured in a dark, climate-controlled box. But when faced with this jarring, exclusionary rhetoric, The PBS reflex kicked in violently. The adults sitting in those darkened auditoriums remembered the quiet, familiar voice echoing across the decades. But you don't have to take my word for it. They had been trained to recognize that the truest sign of a trustworthy teacher is one who encourages you to verify the lesson yourself. So, when the megachurch CEO declared that caring for the earth was a distraction from the real work of saving souls, they didn't passively accept the pastor's frantic assurances. They did exactly what they had been trained to do. Together, they went to the library, opened the text, sought out historical context, and cross-examined the sermon. What they discovered when they bypassed the bumper sticker theology of their youth and dug into the actual text was earth-shattering. They returned to the opening chapters of Genesis and realized that humanity's original, uncorrupted vocation was to cultivate and keep the garden. It was a mandate of localized stewardship, a calling to defend the trees and the soil long before the concept of sin even entered the narrative. They read the Psalms, where the rivers clap their hands and the forests sing for joy before the Lord, painting a picture of an environment that's not dead material but a living, worshiping entity. They turned to the Apostle Paul in Romans 8. They read that creation isn't eagerly awaiting its own incineration, but is rather groaning as in the pains of childbirth, eagerly awaiting its redemption and the revelation of the children of God. This rigorous Berean investigation wasn't limited to biblical exegesis. It extended to the broader intellectual lineage of Christian thought. Long before the Planeteers received their rings, the great architects of modern Christian imagination understood the sacredness of the canopy. Academic studies of the literary works of authors such as J.R.R. Tolkien have revealed a profound orthodox environmentalism. In Middle-earth, the ultimate manifestation of industrial demonic evil was the mechanized destruction of the ancient forests, while the truest heroes were those who fiercely protected the earth's deep roots and the quiet peace of their local shire. The realization crystallized for this generation. The defense of creation wasn't a modern secular invention. It was the historic, orthodox baseline of the faith. The modern hyper-capitalist church was the actual theological anomaly. This process of rigorous, painful investigation came to be known in the cultural lexicon as deconstruction, and the institutional church truly panicked. Pastors preached fiery sermons warning about the disease of deconstruction, framing it as a rebellious backsliding into secularism and a cynical trend. The institution treated congregants' questions not as a plea for deeper understanding, but as an act of treason against the system. But for the church in the wilderness, this ecological deconstruction was never a bug in the system. It was a feature. It was the necessary theological immune response of a healthy soul rejecting a toxic pathogen. They weren't losing their faith. They were shedding a cheap, Americanized counterfeit that treated God's masterpiece as a disposable commodity. Asking hard questions, dismantling toxic theology, and refusing to accept bumper sticker apologetics was simply the application of the reading rainbow ethic to their own faith. By refusing to take the empire's word for it, they stripped away the capitalist, hyper-individualized, and politically weaponized savior of modern evangelicalism. They recognized that you can't separate the Creator from His creation. If God called the physical world good, then treating it as a corporate dumping ground is a profound act of blasphemy. The latchkey disciples realized that investigating the claims of the powerful isn't rebellion. It's the truest, most noble form of spiritual engagement. They were reclaiming the ancient, orthodox truth that the institutional church had traded away for a seat at Caesar's table. They lost their religion, but they kept the first directive. Fast forward 4 decades from the original book's publication, and the Lorax returned to the cultural consciousness through a brightly colored 2012 animated adaptation. While the film took inevitable Hollywood liberties, it introduced a brilliant, devastating visual metaphor for the modern era: Thneedville. This walled-off, highly engineered city of convenience was a synthetic utopia. In Thneedville, everything was made of plastic. nature was entirely artificial, and even the clean air was a privatized commodity sold in plastic bottles by a corporation. The citizens of Thneedville were perpetually entertained and completely isolated from the dark, toxic wasteland just outside their towering walls. Thneedville is the ultimate realization of the American dream that the evangelical subculture so eagerly baptized. It represents the theology of extraction taken to its logical, terrifying conclusion. In many ways, the modern institutional church helped build a spiritual Thneedville. In this comfortable, insular ecosystem, believers could gladly live in a bubble of convenience, completely numb to the fact that the real world outside the walls was groaning in pain. This synthetic anesthesia is the modern equivalent of the golden idol in VeggieTales, the massive chocolate bunny of consumerist comfort that demands we bow down, comply, and ignore the suffering of the laborers and the land. The institution implicitly told us that as long as our personal, interior lives were sanitized and our walls were high enough to keep out cultural threats, the ecological destruction of the earth simply didn't matter. But the generation discipled by weekday television refused to stay inside Thneedville. They remembered the subversive lessons of their youth. They remembered that a true incarnational faith doesn't hide behind synthetic walls. It marches outside and looks honestly at the ruin. The profound climax of the Lorax occurs when the onceler, now old and sitting in the ruins of his own greed, drops something into the hands of a young boy. It's the very last Truffula seed. He tells the boy to plant it, treat it with care, and give it clean water. This perfectly encapsulates the heavy sacred burden that has been passed to millennial and Gen Z believers. The institutional gatekeepers may have failed to protect the forest. They may have traded the Genesis mandate for political dominance and prioritized the machine over the sacred canopy. But underneath the rubble of American civil religion, the seed of the true gospel remains. The church in the wilderness isn't a monument to lost faith. It's a nursery. It's a decentralized, distributed network of exiles who've looked at the scorched earth left by the oncelers of the world and decided to rebuild. They're a strange, beautiful, terrifying synthesis of their upbringing. They possess a relentless, unyielding ferocity to tear down the walls of Thneedville and disrupt the systems of ecological oppression. Yet they also possess the incarnational grace of Mr. Rogers to kneel in the dirt, love their neighbors without condition, and carefully tend the soil of their local communities. In the closing pages of his prophetic warning, Dr. Seuss offered a benediction that now serves as the missiological mandate for this entire generation. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. To the spiritual exiles, the deconstructors, and the latchkey disciples, you're the ones holding the seed. You're the generation raised to be radicals. Don't let the religious empire convince you that your refusal to comply is a loss of faith. Your holy curiosity, your demand for systemic justice, and your deep reverence for the sacred canopy are exactly where the Spirit of God is moving. So walk out of the plastic city, reject the anesthesia of convenience, take the seed into the wilderness, and do the quiet, unglamorous, and honest revolutionary work of replanting the garden. If you found yourself nodding along to this exploration, if you vividly remember sitting on that living room carpet, quietly absorbing the profound lessons of stewardship that the empire tried to ignore, then I want you to know that you're not alone out here in the wilderness. The work of deconstruction and reconstruction isn't meant to be done in isolation. To help keep this decentralized Berean book club thriving, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this episode. The algorithm is its own kind of machine, and sharing this work with a friend, a fellow exile, or anyone else who might need a reminder that they're not crazy is exactly how we bypass it and build our own network. I also want to hear from you. What was the cartoon, the book, or the specific weekday broadcast that first opened your eyes to the sacred canopy? Head over to the Substack and join the conversation in the comments. That's where the real relational community building happens, far away from the noise of the performative spectacle. Finally, if you value this kind of deep dive cultural excavation and have the means to do so, please consider supporting the project. Whether it's upgrading to a paid subscription or dropping a one-time contribution, your support is the soil that allows this work to grow. It gives me the independence to keep stripping the paint, digging into the text, and producing these essays. Until next time, keep reading, keep asking the hard questions, and keep doing the quiet, unglamorous work of replanting the garden in your own neighborhood. I'm Ellison Keller, and remember, the power is yours.